Hi, this is the second video in a three-part series examining identity within the context of transitioning to college. In the first video, we got to know ourselves better by reflecting on our personal and social identities and by creating identity wheels. In this video, we'll discuss saliency, visibility, and the intersection of identities. And then in the next video, we'll bring all of these concepts together to think about how we can intentionally engage with our identities within the transition to college. There are two main objectives for this video. First, we'll define and explore identity saliency and visibility or invisibility. And then we'll consider our identities at their intersections rather than our identities as distinct and unrelated entities. What I mean by that is that we all hold multiple identities, and we usually see ourselves as a combination of identities. For example, I identify as male and Asian. Rarely do I enter an interaction where I only see myself as male or I see myself only as Asian. Most of the time, as I'm talking and interacting with other people, both of those identities are important to me at the same time. Identity saliency refers to what aspects of our identity are relevant to us at a given moment. I like the word saliency better than important, because I would argue that all aspects of our identity are important. It just matters what is happening right now, which aspects of our identity become more relevant to the situation. In that sense, identity is contextual. It's based on the environment that we're in, our physical environment, where we are at any given moment, our social environment, who is around us, our situational environment, what is happening right now, and then our temporal environment, where in time we are. One example of this is that I work with students of color, and many of them grew up in neighborhoods that were predominantly people of color. And then as they transition to colleges that are majority white, their race becomes much more salient to them because as they look around, they don't see other people who look like them. Another example of this might be students who grow up in low-income families and low-income neighborhoods being surrounded by classmates who are from upper middle class and upper class socioeconomic classes. And so in those social situations, their class becomes much more relevant or salient to them. One final example, a lot of students I work with from Boston public schools come to Northeastern, and they recognize that even though Northeastern is located in the city of Boston, when they set foot on campus, they no longer feel like they are in Boston because the campus itself is its own environment and culture. I would also argue that identity exploration is critical to recognizing the saliency of our identities. In other words, unless we take the time to reflect upon and think about our own identities, it's really hard then to recognize which parts of our identities are going to be more salient or relevant at any given moment. So here's a moment to pause and reflect. What identities are most salient to you right now as you think about the transition from high school to college? And can you think of situations in which different identities emerge as being more important or salient to you? So think about different settings that you find yourselves in, whether it's physical environment, whether you're surrounded by different people, which parts of your identity emerge or fall back in those different situations. Next, we'll talk about visible versus invisible identities, and these terms mean exactly what we think they do. Our identities, in large part, are based on what we can see, at least upon initial interactions with people. So two questions I would ask are, what identities do we impose on others rather than allowing them to define for themselves? And the flip side of that is, what identities do others impose on us, particularly those that are not as salient? So I'll use a personal example here. As somebody who identifies as Asian and who looks Asian, I had a lot of advisors and professors in high school and college suggest that I join an Asian affinity group or get connected with the Asian American Center. And while that was certainly part of my identity, it was not as salient to me as other aspects of my identity. But because that's what they saw about me, those were the suggestions that they could make in those moments. And then what I found when I got into those spaces is that a lot of the students I interacted with were international Asian students and did not necessarily have the same concerns or questions and experiences that I had as an Asian American student who grew up in the United States. What I needed most, what was more salient to me, was invisible, in that I wanted to be in community with other children of immigrants. But because people cannot see that aspect of my identity, they cannot give me those kinds of suggestions and point me in the right direction. A follow-up question, too, is how our implicit biases impact our interactions with others. What I mean by this is that we all have these mental shortcuts that are based on how we see and understand different groups of people. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative, but based on what we can see from people, how might those biases color the ways in which we see and interact with people before we really get to know them? So let's pause and reflect on that. What are your visible identities and what are your invisible identities? It's important to recognize those because people don't see your invisible identities, and you'll have to think about how you help them get to know those aspects of yourself. Do you ever feel misunderstood because people only see your visible identities? And then, taking some ownership of this, when have you imposed identities onto others or had them impose identities onto you? And what was the result of those? The intersection of identities talks about the fact that rarely does one single identity define a person. Most of our experiences are the product of two or more aspects of our identity interacting with each other at a given time. Being a former math teacher, I really like Venn diagrams, so I'm going to subject you to some of them. So as I've mentioned a few times, I am an Asian male, and so most of the times I'm operating at the intersection of those two identities. Now, there are certain times, for example, if I'm in a group that's predominantly Asian, I may not have to think about being Asian as much because I'm around people who share that identity, share similar values, customs, cultures, and so on. So my identity as male might be more salient. On the other hand, if I'm in a group that is predominantly male, perhaps my identity as Asian is going to be more salient. But again, in most interactions, I'm operating at the intersection of those two identities. I will see the world through the lens of being an Asian male, and most people will see me as an Asian male. Another way to look at intersections or Venn diagrams is to look at nested circles. So again, I'll use myself as an example. Most people who look at me will recognize that I am Asian, but they may not know that I am Southeast Asian, or more specifically, Vietnamese. Now, why is this important? You may have heard of the myth of the model minority, which sees Asians as good at math or good at school, well represented in higher education. They also see Asians as being quiet and submissive in most social settings. What that does is it fails to recognize the diversity of Asian experiences, instead treating all Asians as being the same. What we know, though, is that when we disaggregate the data, not all Asians are well represented in higher education. Southeast Asians, Pacific Islanders, and many subgroups of South Asians are not well represented in higher ed. So when we treat all Asians the same, we begin to put certain expectations or act out on biases that fail to recognize individual lived experiences that people bring to the table. Intersectionality is a much more nuanced way of talking about the intersection of identities. It's a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 and asks what happens at the intersection of two or more marginalized identities. One example of this came up in the 1970s when 5 black women sued General Motors, a car company, for discrimination in their practices. The court ruled against the women, saying that there was no discrimination. The factory hired and kept black men to work in their factory jobs, physical labor factory jobs, and therefore the company did not discriminate against blacks. The company also had white women working in their offices, and therefore the company did not discriminate against women. So the court threw out this case, saying that there was no discrimination against these black female plaintiffs. However, what Kimberly Crenshaw argued is that at the intersection of those two marginalized identities, being black and being female, there was a unique form of discrimination that the courts and others were not recognizing. I mention this because if we hold multiple marginalized identities, or we recognize that others do, we need to be much more intentional about how we support ourselves and one another through different transitions and experiences in different environments. In conclusion, some things for you to think about. What are some of the intersections of identities that are most salient to you? And what happens when you are at the intersection of a visible and an invisible identity?